You're listening to The Sacred Sofa, a podcast that explores all things theology and therapy. My name is Grace Brown. I'm a registered psychotherapist, certified Canadian counselor, and owner of Journey with Grace Counseling Services.
And I'm Brad Watson, pastor of Nexus Church and author of the book, A Path Called Compelling. Welcome to The Sacred Sofa. Good day, everyone, and welcome back to The Sacred Sofa, and I'm here with Grace, as always, and of course, it's been a long delay since we've had a new episode, but we'll get to that in a second, but I just want to welcome Grace in here. Grace, great to be back with you again, taping one of these.
Yes, good to see you, Brad. I've missed you, my friend. I've missed you.
Yeah, I know. Our weekly meetings have been interrupted, so maybe we thought we would give our listeners here a little a clue into what's been going on here. If you'll recall, our last episode was actually, our last couple episodes, I believe, were on grief. And incidentally, early in January, both Grace and I lost a very close friend of ours. And so that sort of set our new year off on a fairly melancholy note, you could say. And so we just took some time there. And before we knew it, all of a sudden, it's past Easter and spring is here, and oh my goodness, time has flown by. It's been a long winter, but time has flown by. So we are back hoping to tidy a few things up because normally we take a break kind of post-Easter anyway, but we thought we'd better get in here and tidy a few things up. But I'm not sure if there's anything you want to add to that, Grace, but just sort of a little explanation why we've been absent for so long.
Yes, I think it was worth giving our listeners an update. We enjoy our time together and we missed each other, but we did honor our need to grieve individually and grieve as a part of our community and Nexus community. And so we thank you so much for not only your listenership, but for your patience with us. And we're happy to be back and bringing some theology and therapy to you once again.
Yes, back at it we go. And so our plan is an episode today on anthropology. I'll get to that in a second. And then I think we're going to do something a little interesting next week, talking about some lessons learned in our time together maybe here. So anyway, that's for next week. But shall I jump in here, Grace, with what we've been,
You already dumped this huge word on us, anthropology.
Anthropology.
So we need to start there.
Yes. Now, anthropology, I know it's one of those big words. It's really, you can sort of answer the question what it's about in saying, what do you think human beings are like? That sort of anthropology is the study of human beings, you could say, of humans. And there are many different, and I'm sure we're going to unpack this here. I'm excited about that. There's many different anthropologies ranging all the way from humans are inherently good, and the only thing that sort of brings us down is being structured by unjust systems and stuff like that, all the way to a very low anthropology. And you'll find some of the worst of those, I would say, sometimes in churches, actually, which might throw around phrases like being totally depraved and humans are capable of no good whatsoever, right? So it sort of straddles the line from humans as great to awful in between. Now, what I've been advocating for, now you have to give me a bit to unpack this, is a lower anthropology, not the lowest anthropology, but a sort of lower anthropology because of some of the pressures high anthropology brings. But I want to clarify, one of the big claims in this series that we've been working on at Nexus is not that human beings are awful or terrible, but the idea is to just describe human beings honestly. And again, a high anthropology would say humans are almost always trustworthy. We're guided best by our inner voice. We're just waiting for enough freedom and affirmation to flourish. A low anthropology would say something a bit more sober. And in my estimation, this is the strange part, it can become a bit more merciful. And the three big pillars of a low anthropology that we've been exploring at Nexus are these. First, that we are limited in our capacity, which sounds obvious. Second, that we're internally conflicted. We don't always know what we want or do what we want. And then third, we're self-centered by default. That one's perhaps the most harsh. So those three things together, they can sound severe at first, especially if you have any history with shame-based religion. I get it might be setting off alarm bells, but the point is not that. The point is more realism about who we are. And I think what, for me, makes a lower anthropology feel like good news is, for me, it names why so many of us feel exhausted. Because I think we're living inside a cultural story that says, with the right tools, with the right hacks, insights, strategies, we should be able to become more than we are. And I think the pressure of that high anthropology story is immense. And I think it leads to things like burnout. Whereas a lower anthropology, I think, interrupts the pressure. I think it says the problem may not be that you're failing at being a person. The problem is that maybe you've been given an impossible picture of what it means to be human. So,
Okay.
I'm curious, having set that up there, Grace, when people come into therapy in your practice, right? I'm curious how often you find people exhausted and how much of that has to do with maybe some of our ideas of self-improvement. And if it does, are there ways you help individuals distinguish between, say, healthy growth and maybe a more demanding pressure or a fantasy that we should be able to constantly optimize ourselves?
That's a really good starting question. And thanks for setting up the stage. I like this. You know, I'm a therapist. I love a spectrum, right?
Yeah,
The
right,
high, low
right.
spectrum, I think, is very relevant here.
Yeah.
But in a word, yes, you know, folks will come and they're absolutely exhausted. I'd say one of the main issues is feeling overwhelmed and exhausted. And that comes largely from trying to fit into others' ideals of who they should be. You know, and you and I are including ourselves in that community, right? You know, and those ideals can often start with families of origin, continue on with peer pressures as a student, maybe. It absolutely includes society's ideal of who we are, who we should be, or who we should look like. The reality is there are multiple messages that we're getting that are telling all of us that we should do more and be more. And so part of the therapeutic work is working with clients to identify first, what are the messages? Then we explore, where do they come from? And then we can start to spend time reflecting on how well are these influences, these messages working? And are these working to create positive, sustainable, and relevant change?
Right. That's the question, right? So, okay, so I'm not imagining things. There is a pressure that many of us are feeling and experiencing. So maybe what I thought I'd do is take us through these three pillars and just explore them. So we'll start with the first one. The first pillar of a lower anthropology is that we're limited, which again, to me feels so on the nose and self-obvious, but it doesn't always feel that way when you're trying in life to run around and get everything done and feeling like you need to improve. But the big point is that a lot of times I think we mistake limitation with moral failure. And I think what a lower anthropology is trying to say is being limited, a finite human being, is not a moral failure. We're bound by time and energy, and our bodies have needs, and we're bound by our history, personality, perspective. So we can only do so much. We can only know so much, carry so much. And yet, I feel like, at least I know this in my own life, we don't experience that sensation as neutrally. A lot of times I think we experience them as a bit of an accusation. So, for instance, we can feel tired and interpret that as, oh, I'm tired. Oh, does that mean I'm lazy? Or we feel confused and we interpret that as, I guess I'm incompetent. Or one I personally struggle with is anytime I need help, I feel deficient. And I think a lower anthropology here can become pastoral. It says, of course, you can't do everything. Of course, you made decisions with limited energy, partial information. And of course, life includes regret, exhaustion, all that stuff. The idea is that's not proof you failed the test of adulthood. That's just what it means to be human. So, I think what I'm trying to understand, at least from my perspective, is why are so many people quick to feel shame about our limits? Because I know that hits me sometimes rather than compassion. And what helps someone begin to experience limitations, say, as reality rather than, oh, you're a bad person or indictment?
Well, the feeling of shame is as old as humanity, as on the timeline of life. Like that is an emotion that goes way back to our human origins. If we talk about the creation story in the Hebrew scriptures, Adam and Eve in the garden. And as soon as they were held accountable for taking the fruit, what did they move into? Shame. Something's wrong with us. They tried to cover and hide themselves. And so this goes way back, to origin of humanity. And it's an automatic default emotion when we're being held to a particular standard or being held to accountability. And a feeling of shame rather than self-compassion can absolutely arise when we believe the misbeliefs that we can do more and be more without healthy boundaries and balance. When I'm working with clients, there are quite a few exercises that I use throughout our therapeutic journey, but I'll share two of them. Okay. The first one is an activity audit. The second one is something called the jar exercise. So let's start with the activity audit.
Right.
The activity audit is I invite clients to literally write down their activities in a day. Right. And then they're asked to assign time values to each activity.
Okay.
And every time they reflect on being the time in an activity, they actually start to realize they're in overdraft or they just don't have enough time to do, especially the fun things, because we've all been socialized to work before you play kind of thing.
Right.
So after that, and we're inviting self-compassion, by the way, on this journey, because as the light bulb starts to come on, automatically we're moving into shame and guilt. And it's like, whoa, let's just be curious right now before we try to be critical. Okay? And then we move into the jar exercise. And this exercise was actually made famous by Stephen Covey in 1993. It's also called the rocks, pebbles, and sand exercise.
Right.
And so the jar exercise starts with a question. How do you fill a jar with rocks, pebbles, and sand? The answer is you start with rocks, right? The big things go in first, then the pebbles, and then any remaining space can be filled with sand.
Right.
Little bit of a cheat sheet. Sand is optional. You don't actually have to fill the gaps.
Right.
Okay? And so this exercise helps them reflect and identify the values and then prioritize where to place the energy first so that you do have enough. And then you're able to focus on what's truly important. Prioritizing values helps prioritize and focus our time and our energy. It influences the boundaries that would help us say yes and when to say no. And then all of this with intention on a regular basis can lead to feeling more energized rather than feeling exhausted.
That's I think many of us have heard about the rock, pebble, sand thing, and yet it's something so important to keep coming back to because it really does make a lot of sense, right? And how often the little sand things get the priority. So that's fascinating. That seems like a helpful exercise to return to. Keeping in terms with how we're limited, I think that we're living in a moment, you could say, where there's a myth that we're told that with the right technique, the right class, routine, system, we can transcend our limitations. And I was just laughing because a few weeks ago, I don't know how it got into my inbox, but I got an email from Masterclass. Masterclass is this online, they sell you seminars or classes, whatever.
Right.
And the one they pitched to me, I don't know how they got my email, how it ended up in my inbox, was a negotiating masterclass with some FBI guy who's negotiated with terrorists, whatever. And, the promise of the class is with this class, you'll be able to negotiate in any forum from work to family, whatever. And I sat there going, why? Like, do I need to negotiate? Anyway, it was just a funny idea, but the way they pitched it is in my head, I'm going, I could be better at negotiating with people, whether it's my children or whatever. But I think it speaks to the deeper point I'm trying to make, which is that modern life keeps these ideas in front of us, keeps selling us the idea that there's always more improvement to be done. And once you can improve becomes the air you breathe, right? It doesn't stay optional. It becomes you should improve, and then you should never stop improving. And I think that shift matters psychologically and spiritually, because I think once constant improvement becomes assumed, any encounter with our limits feels like failure. And so the person who cannot hold it all together just doesn't feel human anymore. We feel behind, or that's how I often feel, behind or defective. And I think what a lower anthropology does is push back and say, maybe the issue is not always you lack discipline. Maybe the issue is that you've internalized a superhuman standard and are calling it normal. And, you know, the interesting thing is a lot of stuff gets mixed up here as well, whether it's going to church or therapy as well. That can feel part of a self-optimization culture. And yet, how do we sort of make things realistic for people? So that's what I'm curious with you. How does endless self-optimization in our culture, what does that do to people emotionally? And how do you help someone maybe recover a more humane sense of what a life is supposed to feel like?
I really like where we're headed here, Brad. And I really love the work of one of my favorite clinical psychologists, Dr. Raquel Martin. Dr. Martin says that often we judge ourselves critically for not having enough discipline when the real issue is we don't have enough capacity.
Right.
So if I want to drive, you know, we've talked about, you know, doing an extended road trip on a vacation, and we will at some point. But if I want to drive, even say Toronto, right? I got to have enough gas in the car.
Right.
It doesn't matter how much I wish and hope to be on the other side of, you know, the 401. I gotta have the gas in the car. And so sometimes we're judging ourselves because, oh, I haven't been able to do this, that, and the other. But it's not because you don't have enough strategies or hacks or discipline. You just don't have enough gas in the tank to do the thing.
Right.
And so when we continue to operate outside of our own values, that sends us into overdraft. When we continue to try to morph ourselves into someone else's ideals, when we lose sight of the why we're doing what we're doing, and then don't hold a healthy view of self and our values, we're not going to have capacity. We're not going to have capacity to create the strategies to support our choices.
Right. Right.
And as you said, the more you believe you're failing, then the greater the risk for the shame spiral. And shame is not a life-giving emotion. It's a bottomless spiral into despair. And then the good and abundant life that has been promised us feels so hopeless to achieve.
Right. Wow. Yeah. So, okay. So it's nice to know on my end that you've got, you know, I'm not familiar with Dr. Raquel Martin, but other people are pointing this out. Good stuff, eh?
She also has this campaign, if we want to say, or movement, where it's called Burn the Cape. You know, and she's largely speaking to women because there's this idea that we can be, you know, superhuman, and it's like, and they used to say things like, you know what, it's okay to lay your cape down, you know, take a moment, take the cape off. And she's like, burn the cape, because we don't want to keep picking up this thing that is dragging us down and influencing all of this overproduction. Like, just stop.
Right, right. You know, and there's still such a inequality there as someone married to a woman who works full time, and just seeing the pressures that are on her that don't get past me, like little things like arranging the kids' schedules. Just by default, it happens to be moms who are always texting around. And, you know, she's kind of like, I wish you would organize once. And I'm like, well, no one messages me, right? But all these hidden expectations on women to have the full-time job, to, you know, make sure the house is clean, make sure the kids get around. It's just a lot. So, and then that feeling that when you're doing a lot capacity, sometimes we feel like we're not doing anything well, and that can hurt our sense of self as well, right? But yeah, that's fascinating. That's good to get a name like Dr. Raquel Martin out there. That sounds like a good campaign to look into.
Lots of good stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
Lots of good stuff.
more on the limited self, one of the more humbling aspects, I would say, it's not just that we have limited energy or capacity, but also that we have limited sight, right? So we see the world through lenses. We're shaped by our upbringing, our wounds, our fears, desires, social location, class, all that stuff, right? And the problem is, though, they feel at times invisible to us. So our interpretation of reality can feel like reality itself. And I think it speaks to why it's so hard to spot our own blind spots, you know? And I've heard it said somewhere, I can't remember where, that every lens bears some smudge, because I like that idea. It invites the humility without collapsing into complete cynicism, but it invites the humility of, okay, I may not be seeing things straight here. And we're saying nobody sees fully. And I think growth requires community in that respect, because if I can't fully trust all the way my own perception, then I need other people, not just for comfort, but for clarity. And I think this is a rich bridge, it seems to me, into psychotherapy, because therapy is often one of the few spaces, I would say, where someone's private interpretation of the reality gets gently interrupted by the other, by the therapist, right? So I'm curious, how do you help people recognize that maybe on something they might be sincerely wrong about themselves or about a situation? And how do you do that without putting the guardrail, the defense mechanisms up, you know, without making people feel silly or stupid? You know, how does that work in therapy?
You mentioned earlier on humility, and I want to add to that vulnerability. Like it takes humility and the courage to be vulnerable to even go into a space of community, whether it's with a therapist or with a friend, to give them insight, to allow them to take insight into your life. And so I think that's an important place to begin. And I want to also then continue with my sort of trademark phrase. My clients are often this like, I remember this when I'm thinking, or
Yes.
and I often say, I start with them and say, please be curious, not critical. Right? If we view it through the lens of curiosity, we're less likely to be critical.
Right.
Most times people who come to therapy recognize that something is just not working. There's the things that they've tried that just aren't translating to success or even satisfaction. And so with curiosity as the lens, we can work to explore and investigate without judgment. And then we're keeping a close eye out for shame and making sure we're inviting self-compassion and patience along for the journey.
Yeah, I like that. And I think, just as you said, reaching out for therapy is probably the first sign that you realize maybe you're not seeing everything clearly and need help in that discerning process. That's great. The second pillar, of course, of lower anthropology is that we're divided, and that maybe doesn't make a lot of sense on the surface, but it simply means that we're conflicted inside and sometimes want different things, right? So a few that come to mind for me is, I want deeper friendships, but I also want to sit on the couch at night. So I might dodge an invitation, or I want more peace and tranquility in my life, but I can't help it. I keep doom scrolling, or I want better health, but I eat chips at 11 p.m., right? So there's all these sort of different things that we say we want, and then we act differently. Or we might even say, this is my true value, but then we fail to live up to it. And I think what makes this so important is that it challenges this fantasy that clarity alone is enough, right? Like I can know these are the right decisions, but we often assume that if I can just figure out the right thing, then I'll do it. But I think a low anthropology says, whoa, the self is not quite a straight line. It's more like an internal tug of war at times. And, you know, the great, he was an anthropologist, psychologist, William James back in the early day, just called it, a divided self. And even Paul, right? I love Romans 7. Because it just rings true to me, right? He talks about, I do not do the good I want, and I hate the things that I do at times, right? So he's speaking to this internal conflict, and I don't think this is just church weirdness, right? Like I think there's something here. So what do you make of, with we humans, the gap between intention and action, and why do people so often know what would be good for them and then still move in the other direction?
Oh, we don't have as much time as I would like to unpack this question. But and I think our listeners understand that a lot of this is just going to be summarized because,
Of course.
in terms of the therapeutic process, these are multiple sessions and, depending on the person, can be a regular holistic lifelong journey.
Right.
But I'll keep it down to this for today. I recently attended a webinar about emotional dysregulation. Okay, so that's the inability to manage our emotions. Emotions become overwhelming. And there's a new therapeutic intervention called emotional regulation training. Okay? And it's another way to use mindfulness to explore our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And in the webinar, Dr. Doug Menon, who facilitated the webinar, he talked about how our brains are trained to seek two primary things. They're trained to seek safety and reward. Now, this hour-long webinar was fascinating, and it already has, influenced a lot of internet searching and courses, and yeah, I think you'd love it, Brad.
Okay.
So fascinating stuff. So largely, our brains are most often seeking the effects of dopamine, or what we call the happy hormone. So chips versus carrot sticks.
Right.
Social media versus the structured bedtime. I mean, the list goes on, right? And it takes discipline to seek out a more long-term reward rather than the quick fix or the distraction. Secondly, the desire for safety is also relevant. When we're faced with a task that causes anxiety or feels overwhelming, our brain automatically wants to take the path of least resistance and go towards or retreat into safety. And so knowing this is half the battle. Now, it doesn't let us off the hook, but knowing that, it's natural for our brain, our natural wiring is to seek reward, which often is encapsulated in safety.
Right.
But neuroplasticity can also help us here. And that's our brain's ability to be rewired and trained to create new pathways for new behaviors. And so as we expand our safety zone, then we can refine new reward centers. Is that helpful? Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Absolutely. And I think that's a fascinating insight. I'd like to look into that more. And it just helps hearing it's not my sort of native language psychotherapy talk because I'm not trained in that discipline, but to hear it from a psychotherapy lens, how the different ways our minds and brains are sort of competing and what they're trained. I don't know if that's the right word, trained to do, or how, pathways in the brain. So it's all speaking the same language that we're conflicted sometimes as human beings. I'm curious about this one, though, because this was a bit of a revelation for me, just thinking about an old theological question about Paul and his nature with the law. He talks a lot about how the law was necessary, but it's not sufficient. One of the things when you get into anthropology that's interesting is the conflicted self and its relationship with rules are often more revealing than repairing. So there's the classic one. If I say to you, do not think about a pink elephant, well, it becomes almost impossible not to think about a pink elephant, right? And there's this sort of idea that the moment you make a rule, for instance, this month I am going to be more social, and it's like suddenly your soul becomes a lawyer arguing for boundaries. Like, okay, you're going to be more social, but I don't know, there's not great parking wherever you're going, and staying home suddenly feels that much more enticing. Or I make a specific vow, I'm going to be calm with my kids, and it's like there's this ancient prophet of annoyance living inside of me whenever. So it's like the commandment or the rule doesn't create the chaos, but it almost exposes like this chaos that's already inside. And I think it's a useful corrective, because I think many of us still believe our core problem is a lack of rules or structure or resolve. But I think when a good law rule meets resistance, the lesson can't be simply to try harder. It's got to be that the self is layered. There's competing desires, fears, loyalties. So I'm curious, from your perspective, why do stricter rules or more willpower often backfire for people, especially around habits or anger, compulsion, whatever it is?
And this is why I love what I do. And, I'm honored by the privilege of folks coming into my space so we can take some long-term talks and reflections. And it always starts with curiosity. So, if you've been invited out and, your soul lawyer comes out and it's like, what about the parking? What about, right? If we can just be curious as to why the resistance? If we sit with that, we will actually get answers. It may be that you actually are too tired to engage socially with someone that day.
Right.
Maybe your calendar that day was fuller than you anticipated,
right.
or it was full and you just thought you could tag on one last thing.
Yeah.
But we don't often want to sit with the why. We often want to just automatically judge ourselves and just work harder. And so you're right. Rules can't be the only thing that govern the behaviors, the changes that we don't want to do or want to do. It's been said that you can't have rules without relationship. And that relationship is often with self that needs more examining, more time, more curiosity and patience. And rules are actually limited when it comes to governing humanity. There's always going to be an exception to any rule.
Right.
We call them outliers or
yes.
Right? Long-term change requires more than willpower. And in the therapy and addictions world, there's an understanding that there are 7 cycles of change. And this model was developed by Prochaska and De Clemente in the 70s and 80s. And it's a known human pattern to create long-term change. And so if you look it up, you could Google 7 cycles of change and you'll see this beautiful diagram come up. But what they've learned is none of these cycles have anything to do with willpower. Everything to do with understanding our human limitations, the power of community, and the grace and self-compassion we need when we inadvertently as humans relapse into the quick fixes. The cycles of change has everything to do with building on specific strategies and habits to maintain the change we want to see and experience. None of it has anything to do with willpower.
That's fascinating.
But, and I don't know why, people will use shame as a motivator. No one in the planet has ever been motivated by shame.
Right.
I always think of that Game of Thrones scene, shame.
Yes.
There was no change here.
Yeah, exactly.
And so understanding more about what happens through human nature, so cycle of change, pre-contemplation, that means there's no even intention of changing the behavior. And then we move around the cycle to contemplation. So you're now aware there's a problem that exists, but yet there's no commitment to move into action. Then we move into preparation. So we have an intent to change. How do we want to start to address the problem? So let's say you want to exercise more, right? Okay, I have an intention to exercise more. I'm going to get new sneakers. Right? So I'm preparing for the change that I want to do. Then we move into the action stage, which has the most time. We're actually doing something to modify the inertia. We're moving from couch potato into maybe a snail pace of walking.
Sure.
And then over time, and by the way, you often go back and forth in those contemplation stages.
Right.
And over time, you will move into maintenance. So that means you've got sustained change, you've got a new exercise routine. It starts to feel like your new normal, and it replaces the old couch potato behavior. And then we must understand that as part of recovery, there's often relapse. And as soon as you catch that first domino before the rest of the dominoes fall over, you can move back into your maintenance and action stage. But it is part of the human condition to sometimes fall off.
Right.
And if we understand that, we'll be more apt to move into self-compassion rather than shame.
That's good. That's we should post that graph there somewhere for people. I like that, and I love that it talks about the upward spiral, right? Which I think is so important, that it's not just going to be linear. There's going to be relapses, one of the other things that I've learned specifically from you, Grace, in particular, doing this podcast, is that we shouldn't always make human struggle like overly abstract, right? Like sometimes the deepest spiritual insight is not that mystical at all. It's all biological. You need sleep, you need food, you need rest.
Yep.
Your body's not incidental to your spiritual and emotional life. In one of the early sermons I did on the anthropology series, I quoted this line from Mary Carr. She has a poet. She's a poet and has this wonderful poem about human limitations. And then she says, sometimes the voice of God says something painfully obvious and local. So she says, put down the gun, you need a sandwich. And I just love that you can get it. She's talking about being hangry, right? And you're about to explode and hey, you just need something to eat here. And I think that matters because we have come to that time and time again on this podcast, because I think people like me are tempted to moralize what is partly physiological. So my own irritability is a spiritual failure, or burnout can feel like weakness. Dysregulation is proof that I'm just doing bad at life. But I think in lowering my anthropology and how I see humans, it's sort of, for me, has restored embodiment to the conversation. Hunger, exhaustion, stress, they're not the whole story. But you're always a big one proponent of saying this, but they are a part of the story, you know? And I think admitting that can make people less dramatic, less ashamed, often more truthful. And I think it's a great concrete place for therapy and theology to start talking together, right? So how often do emotional or relational problems get intensified because people are ignoring our physiological demands? And what are the first signs that someone is treating a nervous system issue like a moral issue?
Brad, all the time.
Yeah.
We've talked in other podcast episodes about the self-reflection exercise HALTED. Remember, hungry, angry, lonely, tired, excitable, drunk, or drugged. And its partner, the timeout strategy. So we remember that hangry is a thing, and it's biological issue first, and then emotional. Right. And so, again, I'm going to summarize. But there are two conditions that readily come to mind when we talk about that nervous system versus a moral issue. I often see the error of folks trying to treat a nervous system like a moral issue when it comes to anxiety and trauma. And with anxiety and trauma, you can actually visualize a bit of a Venn diagram because there are overlapping symptoms in both. Biologically, there are 4 primary fear responses: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. Now, we must understand that these are instinctive responses, and those instinctive responses are designed to keep us safe in the world. Now, because we don't like to feel afraid, we often criticize ourselves, right? It's like, especially if our nervous system defaults to flight, freeze, or fawn, we label those ones as weak, right?
Okay, yeah.
But it's not weakness, it's survival, right? We think about like a possum, which we don't often see around here. I had an encounter with one in my backyard. It was gross, but, you know, but it worked. Like, I remember calling my husband, Billy, and I'm like, I think there's a dead possum in the backyard. He's like, it's not dead. It's just, you know, pretending. And I was like,
possum.
And so we like had the recycle bin and he's like banging it. And this thing is like laid out. And then just when we turned away, it scuttled away, right?
Oh, that's hilarious.
In the animal kingdom, that is a legitimate strategy to keep itself safe. Because most times you're not going to chomp on something that's dead or dying, right? And so we as humans want to label, you know, fight, flight, freeze, and fawn as weak, but it's not. It's for survival. And so I work with folks for a long time, often to help them understand, believe, and then trust that these responses are natural and no failing on their part. And here's the thing, at the risk of ignoring the message of anxiety and the impact of trauma is actually increased anxiety, which then leads to panic, which then leads to phobias, as well as more debilitating long-term effects of post-traumatic stress disorder. And so there's a lot here, you know, that I've tried to summarize, but it's all a part of our human nature.
Yeah, and I think wrestling with that, what is our human nature, is just so enlightening and helps us feel human and not a failure, right? Like this is just part of the package of what it means to be that. That, that's hilarious that playing possum is such a thing, and you had that encounter. That's hilarious. Um, Now, the third pillar might be the hardest pill initially to swallow, but I think if you unpack it, it becomes more palatable, I guess you could say. But on the surface, saying that humans are self-centered by defaults, it sounds accusatory. And yet, more often than not, it fits the reality of what we see in this world. And I just had the craziest encounter the last weekend. I was my nephew's hockey team was in town, so the family decided to go see the game. And the rest of my family stayed with the wider family on their team's side, but I decided to sit at center ice. And Grace, what I witnessed in this hockey arena was human mayhem. It was just
I can only imagine.
in there. I didn't realize parents took their 11-year-old hockey so seriously, like just. But here I was judging the whole weekend because we went to see about 3 games, and I was just like, these people are brutal. And then just this past Friday, Hux was playing, and I didn't feel like he was getting enough time on the field, and it was hilarious because I had just judged these people, and suddenly I realized in that moment I didn't care about any other kid out there. I was just hyper focused on my own kid in this. Oh, he's not getting enough time to play, but it was just this lesson in how easily we become self-focused and self-absorbed. And it's the point is not that sport parents are unusually terrible. The point is that I think you give any human being a side, a grievance, a tribe, and we quickly want reality arranged in our favor. And I was reflecting on this, that we've sort of done a bit of a rebrand these days. We've turned self-centeredness into different cognitive biases and fallacies. And I think they're all fantastic. I was trying to track down exactly how many cognitive biases psychology has identified. And I've got up to, depending on the source, up to 188 distinct cognitive biases. It could be more like 150. There's some overlap, but there's all these different ones. Are self-serving bias, confirmation bias. But what I'm realizing is that as I work through them, that they're really just modern clinical names for the many ways we are prone to keep ourselves at the center of the story. And I think the crucial point is that self-centeredness is not merely conscious villainy. I'm not trying to be a villain. It's just often reflex, but I think a low anthropology insists that the fact it is reflective does not make it less harmless, my self-centeredness can still block sympathy, cooperation, and love. It can still damage others.
Right.
And because we're poor judges of ourselves, we need help, interruption, community, ultimately forgiveness. So I'm curious, in your line of work, when people are coming to you, how do you help them become more aware of maybe their own self-protective reflexes without pushing them into defensiveness or self-hatred even?
Well, we begin with a lot of what we call psychoeducation, just like we've been doing through this episode, right? Identifying not only patterns and behaviors, but labels, right? 150. That's a lot. That's a lot.
Yeah.
And so as part of, we start with a lot of psychoeducation, and then begin with their story. Where does their story begin? What's the narrative? And then we start to unpack what's the impact of some of these experiences on your journey of life. Holding space for their pain, always trying to see their humanity first. And then we can begin to reflect through the lens of curiosity again, surrounded by self-compassion. And this then often reduces that risk of defensiveness and then even self-hatred sometimes. And if those emotions do arise, we circle back to curiosity, invite self-compassion and patience for their experiences. And so you can tell that this is not going to be a linear, 1, 2, 3 sessions, you're out. Like this can take some time to unpack, examine, uproot these misbeliefs and myths that we have about ourselves.
Oh, that's good. And I think as we sort of wrap up this episode here, I think it's important to remember that, wherever you are on the scale of anthropology, I don't think a lower anthropology it's not trying to lower the bar for human life, but what I think it's trying to do is just tell the truth about us, about the human condition, how complicated we are, how many factors go into our decision making. And I think my hunch is we're going to continue on with this series, but that if we're more honest about who we are, it will allow compassion, community, and grace to become possible across the spectrum. And even if we're limited, divided, self-protective, the answer isn't always just more information, more effort. We need help from outside of ourselves, other people to help us see what we cannot see. And we need forgiveness, of course, but I think the real alternative to both shame and self-idealization is truthful living, not pretending that we're worse than we are, not pretending we're better than we are, just honest about our limits, conflict, selfishness. And I think then the question for me becomes, what kind of healing is actually possible for people like us? And again, I think that's where, the pastoral voice and the voice of the psychotherapist have different lanes, but I think they ultimately have a lot of similar goals and that are deeply complementary. So I'm curious, from your perspective, what does real change actually look like in a human being who's ultimately never going to be perfectly integrated or perfectly self-aware or perfectly unselfish? Like, what does it mean to move forward healthily?
I believe that real change looks like consistently moving forward, making progress. And remember, not a linear way, but in a progressive way. I believe that real change looks like starting again and again and again, right? With patience, not only for yourself, but for others and with others. Real change looks like being willing to hear each other's stories and see each other as the humans that we are, but also as image bearers of deity, full of worth, full of value, in need of mercy and grace, which also includes accountability,
right?
And always, always, always is deserving of love and care.
That is wonderful, Grace. Great final thought there. So I think maybe that would be a good place to leave that for today. And then I'm hoping next week, Grace, we could maybe just reflect on, I guess, almost 3 years of doing this together and maybe draw out some learnings together. So that will be for next week. I'm looking forward to that. But thanks again.
Great.
Thanks again for your wisdom and your insight. It's deeply appreciated.
Yours as well, Brad. I love the complementary nature of what we do, and this has been a fantastic medium for us to explore some of those deeper concepts. Always a pleasure, Brad.
Yes, you too.
Thank you to our listeners, and we will connect next time.